Okay, so first off, let's talk about Miyagi, because in the last video, if you looked at it, it was wrong. So in a unilateral contract where you have, so a unilateral contract is a promise for performance. Under the traditional rule, until performance is finished, the offer can be revoked. And also, you can start performance and you have no obligation to finish. So that's the traditional rule. But under the restatement, you can, once you do partial performance, then the offer can no longer be revoked. But you still do not have to finish. And under Cook, which is a case name, they determined that you had to have substantial performance, and once you had substantial performance, then the offer could also not be revoked, and you also did not have to finish. So under the traditional, the restatement, and Cook, once you start, you're under no obligation to finish. But under the restatement and Cook, once you hit partial or substantial performance, then the offer cannot be revoked. And then if the contract is not unilateral, if it is ambiguous, so it says you can perform or promise, then the promise is acceptance, or the start of performance is acceptance. So once you start, so in the Miyagi hypo, painting the fence, once you start painting the fence, that creates an option contract and it cannot be revoked. But because it's ambiguous and you can promise or perform, under the restatement, it cannot be revoked, but you also you have to finish. Under the traditional rule, though, it's the same. They can revoke at any time. So, in contrast, if you saw the offerer coming out to you, you could say, "I promise to paint your fence," and then you've accepted with the promise, so they can no longer take it. So that's a correction from the last one. So I'm going to go through the rest of the outline that I haven't done and just hit on some things. Midterm is tomorrow, but you might look at these for final exams. So we're looking at the objective theory of contracts. What is on the paper? That's what we are deciding. We're looking at, is there mutual assent? A mutual assent is an offer and an acceptance. Is that there? And you're looking at, if it was revoked, blah, blah, blah. So we've done all of that. I'm just going through my outline to make sure we've done all of this. We did that. Okay, we kind of stopped at Miyagi because I got really confused last time. Okay, so sometimes parties have agreements to agree. They have writings to show that they've been in a negotiation, but they may not have come up with, they may have either left some terms open, or they've said that they will create a contract later. So in Cook, there was no, so this was a commercial building. They said they would have an option to renew and then it was really weird language about what the rental price would be. And it didn't give a formula. It didn't give a how that was going to be decided. It didn't say, like, is it going to be national consideration for rents or so for like the business they were doing, super ambiguous, no real reason, no real way to figure it out. So the court said, hey, we can't, like, this is a material term that cannot be decided. We are not going to decide this for you because you have nothing to go on, and therefore or we're going to say this, there was no contract here. And there was no if they had an arbitration agreement, that may have fixed it too, but they did not. So Restatement 33 is about certainty, and it says, even though a manifestation of intention is intended to be understood as an offer, it cannot be accepted so as to form a contract unless the terms of the contract are reasonably certain. And for like real property, rent and price is actually anything. Rent is a big factor. Then you have the term of the contract are reasonably certain if they provide a basis for determining the existence of a breach and for giving the appropriate remedy. So if you didn't want to put how much something was going to be, you could give a formula, and that would be just fine. The fact that one or more terms of a proposed bargain are left open or uncertain may show that a manifestation of intention is not intended to be understood as an offer or an acceptance. So sometimes it's just an agreement to continue the bargain, and that's not going to hold as a contract. Indefinite price, where the parties manifest an intention not to be bound unless the amount of money to be paid by one of them is fixed or agreed, and it is not fixed or agreed, then it's not a contract. So if it says to be fixed when a price is agreed upon and it's not, then you don't have a contract. Parties have reached an agreement. Okay, so if parties have reached an agreement, this is in principle, but they said, hey, we'll execute a formal writing later, and then they don't, then we're going to, like letters of intent, we're going to say this hinges on the intentions of the party. So did the letter say to start work, and therefore the other party was relying on this saying to start work? So start work, did it authorize work? Did it give the power to terminate an agreement, showing that there actually was an agreement? So those are all things that you would look at to see, was this formal writing a formality, and really there was a contract from this negotiation. Restatement 27 says the existence of contract where written memorial is contemplated. So manifestations of assent that are in themselves sufficient to conclude a contract will not be prevented from so operating by the fact that the parties also manifest an intention to prepare and adopt a written memorial thereof. But the circumstances may show that the agreements are preliminary negotiations. So, and these go under two categories. So, the new formalists look at the agreement, and if it's not on the paper, they do not care. They're like, that's it. They say if you're sloppy, the court's not going to fix that for you, and this helps to create efficiency in our courts because they're not doing things they're not making decisions that the party should have made for the parties. And then you have the anti-formalists, and they think it's better in the long run to fill in the gaps and excuse the makers of bad writings, contracts, of the mistakes. But this poses an efficiency problem in the court, since the court has to do so much extra work that the parties should be doing themselves. All right. So then we have the UCC, and the UCC is a Uniformed Commercial Code. Thank you, words. And it is for the sale of goods. So the common law we just talked about, with the unilateral, bilateral, all of that, that's under the common law, and that's going to be for things that are not goods. So they're going to be services. It could be real property, kind of that. But the Uniform Commercial Code is only for goods. So the formation in general of a contract is 2204, and that's a contract for the sale of goods may be made in any manner sufficient to show agreement, including conduct by both parties which recognizes the existence of such conduct. So conduct can create a contract here. An agreement sufficient to constitute a contract for sale may be found even though the moment of its making is undetermined. Okay, so firm offers under the UCC are option contracts under the common law, and there are some differences. Primarily that in an option contract under common law, there has to be consideration to make the option contract valid, whereas under firm offers under the UCC, there does not need to be consideration. So 2205 says an offer by a merchant, so this is only for merchants, to buy or sell goods in a signed writing, so it needs to be signed, merchant signed, which its terms give assurances that it will be held open, is not revocable. For lack of consideration, which we already said we don't need, during the time stated, or if no time is stated for a reasonable time, but in no event may such a period of irrevocability exceed 3 months. But any such term of assurance on a form supplied by the offeree must be separately signed by the offerer. So, firm offers. A merchant has to be involved. It must be signed. And it must say that it's going to remain open. If no time is stated, then it's a reasonable time, but at no time can it be over 3 months. Okay. So then comment 3 says, a promise made for a longer period will operate under this section to bind the offeror only for the first 3 months of the period, but may be renewed if supported by consideration. So basically you get a free 3 months of an option contract, but then it must be supported by consideration. It may continue for as long as the parties specify. Okay. So, and then comment 4 says, protection is afforded against the inadvertent signing of a firm offer when contained in a form prepared by an offeree by requiring that such a clause be separately authenticated. So that clause needs to be signed separately. So instead of separate consideration, you just have separate signings. Comment 2 says the signing here would consist of minimal, so you could just initial it. That could be found as valid, but it has to be separately acknowledged. Qualified acceptance. Is there a contract? What are the terms of the contract? So an acceptance that proposes an exchange different from the one proposed by the original offerer. So we have two paths. So Helfand says you need to figure out what law you're going to work under. So if you are dealing with services, you're dealing in the common law, and if you're dealing with goods, which is goods are anything movable within at the time of sale. So for goods, you're going to use the UCC, and that's the battle of the forms. So if you're not sure, and this was the maintenance for the cruise ship case, if you're not sure if it's services or goods, you're going to use the predominant purpose test. And this is whether a particular transaction is governed by the UCC rather than the common law or other statutory law hinges on the predominant purpose of the transaction. That is, whether the contract primarily concerns the furnishing of goods or the rendering of services. And when you decide this, you're going to look at the language of the contract. So it's like, is this a contract for service? And then you're going to look at the nature of the business of the supplier. Is this a manufacturer who's making a good and that you're buying and also like putting it in, or is this like a service company? And then you're going to look at the materials and the intrinsic worth of the materials that you're buying. All right, so if you decide predominant services and this is service, or if it's just clearly a service test, you're going to use the common law. And Restatement 59 says purported acceptance. So Rule 59 is the mirror image test, and that is an acceptance of an offer has to match the offer. It has to match the offer. If it doesn't 100% match, then it is considered a counteroffer. And a counteroffer destroys the original offer. It cannot be and or. It destroys the original offer. Restatement 19, conduct as manifestation of assent. The manifestation of assent may be made wholly or partly by written or spoken words by the other's acts or failures for failure to act. The conduct of the party is not effective as manifestation of his assent unless he intends to engage in that conduct. The conduct of the party may manifest assent even though he does not, in fact, assent. Okay, so those are kind of just, those rules are just main contract rules. Yeah, okay. And then you have the UCC, and that is the battle of the forms. So first you're going to ask, is there a contract? The UCC has, okay, so one more thing in common law, One more thing in common law is that, like, if you're passing forms back and forth, like two manufacturers, they're passing forms, they have their own form and you have your own form, then the last form controls. So that can be scary. The last form controls. So they call that the last shot rule. So if it's not mirror image, it's a counteroffer. If you're throwing forms back and forth, the last counteroffer controls. But that's not the UCC. So in the UCC, we have the battle of the forms, and you've got to go through a process. So here's the thing. 22071 says we don't have a mirror image rule. Now, if you 22071 is asking, is there a contract? Now, if you have a mirror image offer acceptance, easy, contract. But that's not generally the battle of the forms. So, a contract under the UCC is a definite and seasonable expression of acceptance or a written confirmation which is sent within a reasonable time operates as an acceptance. So, even though it is still a contract, even if the acceptance contains additional or different terms than those offered or agreed upon. So UCC, you don't need a mirror image. Unless the offer expressly says that the acceptance is conditional on just those terms, that there is a provision saying no terms can be added. In that case, it's binding because the offerer is master of the offer. Okay. So okay, you've got a contract. If you've got a contract, but there are additional or different terms, then you're going to go to 22072. And 22072 has two prongs, and one is the merchant prong, and one is the not merchant prong. Okay, so the additional terms are to be construed. Okay, so the non-merchant prong means that if anyone in the agreement is not a merchant, then you go to the non-merchant prong. So in a non-merchant prong, the additional terms are only proposals to be proposed to be additions to the contract. Only with express assent are the additional terms included. So non-merchant, additional terms, just proposals, no, they can be thrown away. There has to be express assent. Okay, so then we have, so then 2104 is the definition of a merchant. A merchant means a person who deals in goods of the kinds or otherwise by his occupation holds himself out as having knowledge or skill peculiar to the practices or goods involved in the transaction, or to whom such knowledge or skill may be attributed by his employment of an agent or broker or other intermediary who by his occupation holds himself out as having such knowledge or skill. So, manufacturer, yes, merchant. Guy selling his car and runs an ad in the paper, not a merchant. Such terms, okay, so now you have merchants, and this is if all the parties are merchants. If all the parties are merchants, then they have a different rule. If they are all merchants, then the additional terms are automatically a part of the contract. The additional terms for merchants are automatically included in the contract, unless there are three places where this where this won't happen, and it's before, during, and after. So before, if the original offer says you're accepting these terms and nothing more, then you can expressly say you cannot add, you cannot change. Done. Then during, if the additions materially alter, so he liked, they used the word surprise. If it's materially different, so a clause limiting the right of So we use the term like 10-year warranty. That is materially a different thing. If you're a 10-year warranty on the laptop, like that's huge. You have to, like, just ridiculous things. Anything that would be like surprising or shocking is not going to pass this test. So before expressly says you can't add. During, it's materially different and therefore it's cut. After, you notify them within a reasonable time that you are not assenting to the additional terms. So before, during, after. We're not going to go through the hypos. If you're in my class, you should know them. If you're not, you should write them down. Okay, so that's if the terms are additional. But what about when the terms are different? Whether or not additional or different terms will become part of the agreement depends upon provisions of subsection 2. Wait, did I go over? Okay. So, comment 3, whether or not additional or different terms will become part of the agreement depends upon the provisions of subsection 2. And this says, again, if they are materially different and that they alter the original bargain, they will not be included. And with the material difference, they will not be included unless they are expressly agreed to. So, a little different. But if, however, there are terms which would not so change the bargain, they will be incorporated unless notice of an objection to them has already been given or is given within a reasonable time. So, materially different, not going to be added unless you say, yes, we can add this. But not materially different, they are in unless you say, no, I'm not agreeing to that. Comment 6 says, if no answer is received within a reasonable time after additional terms are proposed, it is both fair and commercially sound to assume that their inclusion has been assented to. And then you have comment 6 sub 2, where clauses on confirming forms sent by both parties conflict, each party must be assumed to object to a clause on the other conflicting with the one confirmation by himself. So if they conflict, they're going to, if they conflict, they're going to say, well, then you had notice that they were rejected, and they're going to fall away. So they are not going to be part. If one form says yes and one form says no, both of those things are going to fall away because those were obviously not agreed to. And they're going to say, hey, because those forms both said diametrically opposing things, you had noticed that there was no agreement there. They're not going to make it into what the court is going to enforce in a contract. Okay, so what if you do 22071 and you say, like, I don't see, like, there is not a contract here. There was nothing, like, there was not mutual assent. There was not an acceptance, an offer and acceptance. But now we have two people and they are conducting themselves as if they have a contract. So that is where 22073 comes in. And this says conduct by both parties which recognizes the existence of a contract is sufficient to establish a contract for sale, although the writings of the parties do not otherwise establish a contract. In such cases, the terms of the particular contract consist of those terms on which the writings of the parties agree. So we go, hey, we cannot see things that create a contract, but your conduct is showing us that you have something going on here. So we're going to look at the writings of the parties, and what you agree on in both your writings, we will put in. Okay, so, and then the same goes for things that are different, fall away. Things that are agreed on, come in. And that's what we're going to hold people to. All right, then we have this fun thing called layering contracts, which are generally what we're talking about when we're talking about electronics. So there's 3 different types. There's Shrinkwrap, Click-Wrap, and Browser Wrap. Shrinkwrap is going to be something that like is on the outside of your package, and it's going to be like terms and conditions on there. Click-Wrap is when you're on the computer and it says like click here to agree to these terms. And then Browser Wrap is like when you're on a website and the website says like by by clicking on this website, by being in this website, you are agreeing to the terms. So ways that they try to promote assent is by clicking I agree, or hey, like you must download this. And then for browser wrap, a lot of times the court has to say like, okay, so is this reasonable? Like, if you go onto a page and you have to scroll all the way down to get to the terms, like that's not reasonable. If someone's buying something at the top of the page and never has to go down to actually buy it. And were the terms like prominently displayed so you had noticed that there was something to look at here. And the same thing for Shrinkwrap. If it's, buried in a 25-page manual, like that's not reasonable that someone is going to read that and know what they need to do. Okay, so they do say, they're looking at reasonable for your actual or constructive notice. If it's one sheet of paper on the side of a box and you say, well, I didn't read that, they're going to say, well, that's a shrink wrap contract, and that's very reasonable that like one form that's there that you would read, but I mean, people don't, but I mean, they're looking at the reasonability. So UCC 204A. Contract for sale of goods may be made in any manner sufficient to show agreement, including conduct, by both parties, which recognize existence of such a contract. So with electronic ones, you have the problem because you see something online and maybe you call them. No one calls them, but this was our hypo. And you call them and they give you like the overview of terms, but they're not going to spend 5,000 hours on the phone with you, nor do you want them to. So then they say like, blah, 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 you can return this in 30 days. And you're like, oh, okay, great. And then you give them your credit card number and then they take your money and then they send you the item with terms and services like on the shrink wrap. Great. But then we have a problem because where was the offer? Was the offer their website? Probably not, because usually advertisements and stores are solicitations of an offer. Was the offer your payment and their acceptance was their taking the money plus the shipping? The shipping was the, culmination, or was their shipping it to you the offer, which is weird because you already paid for it, but then you're accepting it is the acceptance. So the shipping is the offer, you're accepting is the acceptance. So with layering contracts, you can see that we have this problem because we have multiple places where there's kind of been offer acceptance, and then you have to decide. And it's different. So if the contract was made when you called and they took your money, then your contract is already made, and therefore the shrink wrap is just additional terms of the contract, and they fall away because your contract is already made. And they're just additional terms, which you don't have to agree to. But if they're saying, no, our sending this to you is the offer, therefore the shrink wrap on the page is our offer, and you receiving it is your acceptance, then you taking it and keeping it, whether you read it or not, is going to be construed as acceptance. So this is where it gets kind of dicey in the contract realm. So 2204A, contract to sale of good may be made in any manner sufficient. So see how there's like many manners is sufficient. But 2206 says, unless otherwise unambiguously indicated by the language or circumstances, an offer to make a contract shall be construed as inviting acceptance in any manner or by any medium reasonable in the circumstances. Thanks, UCC. Like, that's super helpful. Oh, it's not reasonable is like the most unreasonable term in my opinion. Anyway. Okay, an order or other offer to buy goods for prompt or current shipment shall be construed as inviting acceptance either by a prompt promise to ship or by a prompt or current shipment of conforming or non-conforming goods. So now they're just saying, like, if we ship it to you, it's inviting acceptance, which is great, except we already knew that. So where is the offer? And courts go both ways. Buyer paying, acceptance is receiving the money, seller shipping, and buyer keeping can also be construed. So in an exam, you're going to talk through all of those things, and you're going to say where things are different, they fall away, the additional terms, if depending on where the offer is, then the acceptance changes. So you're going to write about that. It's going to be great. Okay, the second part of consideration. Oh, we're almost done. Okay. Really? Maybe. Okay, so anyway, consideration. So in order to have a contract, you need, you know what? No, we're going to stop there. I'm going to make another video on consideration.